Good morning. Now, I want to talk about that in a second, but first I want to tell you about how my morning is going. On the way out the door this morning, I noticed that the wind or some dog or something had knocked over our trash can outside. So I went to pick our trash can up just real quick, and because I was doing real quick, I didn't dump the water out of it first. So when I picked it up and it flipped and the lid came this way, and trash juice hit me all in the face and down the front of my shirt. So I went inside and washed my face and changed my shirt, and here I am. So let me just say a couple things. One, if you're like, something stinks in here, you might be right. And two, man, if you feel like you've been hit in the face with trash this week, we are hopeful that church is still a good place to be. And maybe the best place to be if you've been hit in the face with trash this week or this month or even this morning. Now, one of the things that sometimes can hit us in the face with trash the most is work. And I like this video because it holds a couple of things in tension. The music is soft and like pseudo-relaxing, but also a little foreboding. And then the speed with which everything else moves can suggest a great deal of productivity. But also, if you're like me, that video stresses me out. And we've been talking about, we were walking through this series, as Tiana shared, called TechWise. And it's based on a book by Andy Crouch. Let me say, we at the start of this series, we bought a bunch of these books, and we were overwhelmed by your response to them, so then we tried to get more books, and they were slow getting them to us, but they are here now, so if you want a book and you haven't gotten one yet, they're in guest services for a suggested donation of $10. We got a number of small groups that are walking through this with us, and Lent starts next Wednesday in about 10 days, and during Lent, you're going to be invited. Everyone in our church is going to be invited to take one consistent, meaningful, screen-free hour in your household for 40 days. So we're excited about all the ways we walk through this together. The theme of all this is technology, but we hope it's really a lot about everyday life, because the book begins with the premise of asking the question, what is your family for? What's our family for? What is a household for? How can a church come alongside and support a family? And the book begins with the premise that a household, more than anything else, is for the development of wisdom and courage. We want the wisdom to be able to discern what is good and what is of God, and the courage to act on that discernment. So as we've walked through this, we've been holding some things in tension: wisdom and courage. Last week we talked about the ratio in our lives of creating versus consuming. And this morning I want to talk about the balance in our lives of work and rest, and the ways in which technology, in all of these cases, can subtly creep in. As we've shared, it's not that technology just inherently leads to bad choices. It's that it can kind of quietly, but over time significantly, dull our senses to what wisdom and courage even are. Now, as we've been walking through this series and through everything this year, we've spent a lot of time talking about the word holy, because the word holy is a good church word. It's a word you probably don't use a lot of other places. And this word means set apart, to take a thing and set it apart, to give it significance as this is a different kind of thing. This is a God sort of thing. And often the word holy gets used to describe places, sanctuaries, objects, things like that. But as we've shared, the call on our lives is that we might be pursuing holiness, not just with our objects, but with our very selves. For by one sacrifice he has made perfect forever those who are being made holy. But this morning I want to show you how the fundamental level of holiness in Scripture is attached to something that we might not think. The very idea of holiness in the Bible gets its start in a place that isn't about a place or isn't about an object. We spent time last week in Genesis 1. This morning, I want to look at the beginning of Genesis 2 because this is the first place the word holy shows up in our story. This is Genesis 2, starting in verse 1. Thus, the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. By the seventh day, God had finished the work he'd been doing. So, on the seventh day, God rested from all his work. Then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. The first time the word holy shows up, it's not to describe a sanctuary. It's not even to describe God. The first time the word holy shows up in Scripture, it's to describe a day. It's to describe a Sabbath, because in 6 days, God created everything, and thus on the seventh day, God rested. So the idea of holiness, the idea of taking a thing and setting apart, its foundation is found not in a sacred place or a sacred object, or even in God itself. The foundational idea behind holiness is Sabbath. And as we'll see, one of the foundational ideas behind Sabbath is this question of what is the balance in our lives between work and rest? What is the balance in your life between work and rest? Now, Sabbath and holiness, this connection between the two, it shows up first time the word holy is used, but that's not the only place it gains great significance. When we're talking about the core truths of our faith, the core documents of our faith, we've certainly got the creation story. Many of us would cite the Ten Commandments, right, as one of the core pieces of truth, core pieces of what it means to be someone who follows God, both Old Testament and New Testament. If you think about the Ten Commandments, most of them are short, right? Short and sweet. Don't murder anyone. Don't steal. Don't commit adultery. Pretty short and sweet. But the longest, by far, the longest of the Ten Commandments is Sabbath. This is Exodus 20, starting in verse 8. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, but God rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. So Sabbath and holiness are intricately woven together in the big, capital B, big stories in Scripture, in the creation story, in the Ten Commandments. If you read on, Jesus spends a lot of time in the New Testament the Pharisees spend a lot of time trying to argue with Jesus about Sabbath and his interpretations of it. It's got a core place in our story, but I think if you ask a random Christian, what is the Sabbath about? We tend to treat it very differently, and I would say less significantly than the Bible treats it. We give it much less weight than what the Bible puts on it, and that's really a shame because so much of Sabbath is rest. And that video stresses me out. And our lives can feel like they're moving really, really fast, and Sabbath is not like this secondary creature. Sabbath is foundational, tied at its core to holiness itself, the longest of the Ten Commandments that they spend the most amount of time talking about. But I feel like if you ask the average Christian, tell me about Sabbath, you're going to get one of two responses, or maybe both. The average Christian is going to tell you that Sabbath is the day they go to church, and they're going to tell you that on Sabbath they're not supposed to go to their job. The first part of that is incorrect. You are in church right now, not because it's the Sabbath. If you got a calendar that still starts with Sunday as the first day of the week, literally as God intended, what's the seventh day of the week if Sunday's the first day of the week? Saturday. I think This is Sunday. You're not in this room because it's the Sabbath. In a traditional, literal interpretation, it's not. You're in this room right now on Sunday morning because that's when Jesus was risen. We come to church on Sunday mornings because that's when Christ was risen on the first day of the week. If we were being literal about that, we would meet at sunrise every Sunday. I'm okay with not doing that if you are. So church going for Christians, church going is not exclusively tied to the idea of Sabbath. That's not to say that you can't take Sunday as your Sabbath, but we here, as in all things, we lead with resurrection. So we're doing this together on Sunday morning because that's when Jesus was risen. The other part of that, Sabbath is the part that I don't go to my job. I mean, that's true and accurate. But for a lot of us, let's just assume if you work a Monday through Friday situation, for a lot of us, whether it's Saturday or Sunday, the weekends still kind of end up getting filled with work. And there's a piece of it that's tied to technology, which we'll talk about in a second, the ways in which work finds us now in ways it didn't before and not too long ago. But also, Sabbath can become the thing where we just do errands and catch up on the dishes, and all of that is poorly disguised work. See, for us to, I think, really grasp the idea of what's at play in our lives here, Sabbath is really about three ideas and the ways they come together. And it's what makes Sabbath unique from just taking a day off or taking vacation or things like that. No doubt, as we shared last week, first truth about God is that God created. First truth about us is that we're created in the image of God. So on some level, we're created to create. So we can have a good argument, and I believe this, and on some level, like, work is good and part of the creation story that you and I are created to create. And so in some sense, we're created to work, I think. We can argue about semantics there. But what I know for sure, if we're created in the image of God, is that we are definitely created to rest. But we kind of set that aside and go as fast as things go in that video. So if we're going to try to take Sabbath more seriously, if we're going to examine the balance of work and rest in our lives, then I think we have to consider three ideas when it comes to Sabbath. If you want to take Sabbath well, these three things have to be present. Number one, stop it. The word Sabbath literally means cease. So if you are going to take a Sabbath, yes, don't go to your job. That you're out right away, right? If you're going to go to your job that day, that really is taking it outside the bounds of what Sabbath is. But also, if we are going to cease on Sabbath, we have to consider the ways in which work comes to us. Because as many of us know, or maybe you've experienced if you're of a certain age, it used to be that when you clocked out, that was it. Because you didn't have email. And you didn't have, listen, my staff will tell you, I will text people from work-related things kind of whenever. Because I'm used to it. Because I'm used to people texting me work-related things kind of whenever. Without thinking about or considering, are we working right now? Is this person off today? Is that person off today? Technology, again, not inherently evil from the start, but kind of slowly and subtly has allowed work to find us at home. And that's not to say that there aren't many good things. If you work from home, or if remote work was a real blessing for you in the pandemic, or still is, all of that can be good. But it's the erasure of the boundary and the idea that we are always available that I am here very much to suggest. The idea that we are always available is not good and disrupts our sense of what a home and a household is and what is work and what is rest. So if you're going to take Sabbath, you got to stop, and that includes having some sense of work not getting to you, work not finding its way to you. I take Fridays off. This is up for debate, but theoretically, I'm working right now, so I can't take Sundays. So I take Fridays off. On Fridays, I don't check will@palchurch.com. If you call me on Fridays, I'm not going to answer it. I will check the voicemail to make sure you're not dead. And if you're not dead, then I'll call you back tomorrow. These are just rhythms that, for me, and this is not exclusive to pastors. I think if you have kind of a high relational component kind of job, we have to stop work from getting in there. But also on Fridays, I don't set an alarm in the mornings. My kids are 5 and 2. That's been more fruitful other times and seasons in my life. But work is Sabbath is this opportunity to stop. So we want to stop what we do for a living, and we want to stop the ways it encroaches on us. But what we also want to do is consider how much of that time we're also doing on things that are poorly disguised work. So let's play one of my favorite games called Is It Work? You ready? Up on the screen, number 1, is it work? Yes. Yes, right? If you find laundry life-giving, you come, all right, Stacy's going to preach next week. I just, on a personality test, you were probably so far from me and my brain. I used to think that any form of laundry at any purpose for any person was absolutely work. Now I do think it might kind of depend on how many people live in your household and what's happening. But consider, on your weekends, if you work Monday through Friday, what percentage of that time gets devoted to this or dishes or things that just look like work? This is one of the things that Sabbath requires, is that it makes, I have found, if you take the one as rest, it helps guide us to be better at working the other 6. I'm much, much better at my job and my life when I work 6 and rest 1 than when I just work 7. Or the worst version of this is I work 7, but I don't realize I'm working 7, which is, it's Saturday, but like I just spend it doing all of the other stuff. I would submit for most, if not all, this is work. All right, the next one. Is it work? Is it work? I like this noise. Is it work? Now, some would say, look, it's right there in the name, right? He's working out. It's work. Here's the flip side of that, though, is if your kids are like, Mom, it's homework. It's work. It's right there. I can't do it today. The flip side of all this is I think Jesus, who we find playing faster and looser than the Pharisees would like with the rules about Sabbath, I think there's an invitation with Jesus to say, do you know who gets to decide what work is? You do. So, if this is life-giving on Sabbath, go for it. If it's not, you don't have to. Let's go to the next picture, because I think it's easier to understand when we think of it as this. Number 3, is it work? Is that work? Everybody says no. Here's the truth. If you don't like reading, you're not going to do it on the Sabbath anyway, right? You're like, man, I got to take Sabbath. I got to read 5 chapters of this book. I'm going to hate it so much. But for some, it sounded like for many, this is life-giving. Yeah? So maybe I think, same concept as the working out bit, but just looks a little less sweaty, and a little easier to wrap ourselves around. So on Sabbath, we stop, we cease. But we also understand that we are not here to be Pharisees and say things like, you better just spend your Sabbath sitting on the floor and not doing anything so you don't accidentally work. For Sabbath, we need to stop, but in light of this picture, we also, number 2, we need to rest. Sabbath is invitation to take seriously the question, what gives me rest? We're going to talk about sleep next week. Not just sleep. What gives you rest? What helps pour back into you when it has been poured out of you? When you have been hit in the face with trash, what gives you rest? What helps restore you? Because again, I would argue that we're created to create, no doubt, but we're also created to rest. To take seriously the idea that if God did it, you probably can too. What gives you rest? There's a chance in a room of this size that some of you right now are like, dude, I don't even know anymore. And if so, you should find out. Again, this isn't some sideways secondary thing in Scripture. Sabbath is a fundamental idea connected to holiness. It's the longest of the 10 commandments, and it is in part what Jesus got in the most trouble for. And all of these ideas help us flow through this concept of how do I stop? How do I put it down when it needs to be put down? But also, how do I pick up rest? How do I connect with these things? Stop, rest, and then finally, Sabbath is intended for us to connect indeed with holiness. This is what separates Sabbath from vacation. Sabbath is not just about stopping and resting. Sabbath is about reconnecting with God. So yes, if you want to take Sundays, you can and use this space to reconnect with God. If you want to do that through reading Scripture or something like that, you can. If you hate reading, don't do that on your Sabbath. It's about finding quieter places maybe to pray, slower places. In my past, I've had a small group that I went to on my Sabbath because it was a place that gave me rest and was a place that helped me reconnect with God. Because the truth is, life moves very quickly and it tends not to slow down unless we do it on purpose. Chances are your job is not going to altruistically be like, you know what, I'm going to text them less on the weekend. And chances are, maybe if you have people who really, really love you well, they're going to intentionally try to step in and create space for rest for you. But a lot of times that happens when you're real close to the edge on burnout. The call on this thing is to begin to create these things for ourselves. Because here's the truth about Sabbath. It's meant to be once a week, not once a year, not 2 weeks vacation. This is a rhythm that we are called from the beginning, or even commanded, to introduce into our lives. How can we be better at stopping? How can we be better at resting? And how can we be better at reconnecting with God once a week? Because we're created to create, no doubt, but we're also created to rest. Now, here's what's going to happen in the lobby after this is over, if anyone still wants to come talk to me, even though I might smell like trash. Some of you are going to come up to me and say, hey, that's great, but you don't understand what I do for a living. And that's cool. I like hearing about uniquely what we perceive to be high impact, high stress jobs. This is the fourth different church I've been the pastor of, and I've had this conversation after I preached this sermon 3 other times. I look forward to having it this morning. And sometimes people will give something where you're like, that's interesting. Okay, you don't understand my week. Okay, I see how this or that. But I still haven't heard a better response to this than the first one I got, which is when I was a pastor of a very tiny community of churches, 40 minutes from a Walmart and all that good stuff. Most of that community were farmers. And I went there when I was 24. I bought a suit. I put my suit on the first Sunday I was there. I walked into church. I preached the first sermon, and then I took the jacket off and never put it back on again. Because what was in the congregation were overalls. They came from work, and they were going right back, even on Sunday. And occasionally I would say things. I was 24, and occasionally I would say things that sounded real smart when I was 24 and had been a pastor for 5 minutes. And these people were really gentle and kind with me. And it was a dairy farmer in particular that after I talked about this, he, in the handshake line, he was like, "Preacher, that's real interesting, but the cow's got to be milked every day. Christmas, Easter sunrise, my birthday, the cows have to be milked every day." And he's right, which means that sometimes there is nothing to do except share the work. Sometimes Sabbath requires us to be better. The only way you can really do it is to share the work. Sometimes inherently there's something about it that if we don't let go of some things and share, if we don't help train others to do the milking of the cows and all the things that we do, then there is no other way to rest. So sometimes, especially if you're telling yourself right now, like, this guy, he's 41, he's not any smarter than he was when he was 24, he doesn't know my job in my life. Sometimes the only thing to do is to share the work and to look around and say, who can help me carry this once a week? The invitation to Sabbath is one of freedom. It's not one of more legalism. It's not one of sitting on the floor all day and trying not to do anything. And from experience, as someone who was really good at taking Sabbath before I was married and then got married, and I took a different day than my wife, and it was like, that's too bad. I'm not doing any dishes and laundry on Tuesday. Don't do that. It requires conversation with the people in your household to ensure that your rest isn't someone else's resentment. It requires sharing the work. Alex and I are still figuring out how to do that well or best in different seasons of life. But please, please know, you are created to create, no doubt. But you are also created to rest. God rested. If it's good enough for God, chances are it's all right for us. If I ask the people who know you best, if I ask the people who live with you if you ask the people who know me best about your rhythms of work and rest, what will they say? Can we be better at stopping and just putting it down and turning those notifications off? Can we be better and sometimes give ourselves permission to engage in what truly gives us rest? And can we, in those spaces, not view it as a vacation, but view it as a time to reconnect with the one that we believe will pour back into us better than anything else and help us continue to pursue the lives of creativity and work that we're passionate about and excited about, but we do those things best when we also rest. You and I are created to create, but we are also created to rest.